Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen, and in today's video we're going to take a closer look at the humble comma. Commas are very tiny things, but they're also very important in writing. They are the way that writing breathes. I'll explain that a little more in a moment. And in some cases, commas can drastically change the meaning of a sentence. One sentence or variations on that sentence which features regularly in memes is this one: let's eat children. Depending whether or not you put a comma in that sentence can change the meaning completely. If you don't put a comma in at all, then that sentence means that you're planning to eat some children. You're going to have children for lunch. It's quite a bloodthirsty sentence. However, if you put one tiny comma in there, you can save the lives of those children. If you put a comma after the word eat, that sections off let's eat and makes the reader realise that you're talking to the children, not about them. If we're talking to someone in a sentence and we use their name or their title or we refer to them in some way, we usually indicate that with a comma. So with a comma, that version is let's eat children, and you're inviting the children to come and eat with you rather than actually eating the children. The purpose of commas is to help the reader understand, to make the writing clearer. They help you to get your point across more effectively. So what do I mean about commas being the way that writing breathes? Let's leave writing aside for a moment and look at music. Commas are also used in music. If you play a wind instrument, an instrument that you have to blow to get the sound out of it, then when you're playing the music, you will regularly need to take tiny breaks just to snatch a breath. And where you take those breaths affects the way the music sounds. So often it will be indicated on the music where you should take that breath to make the music sound the way the composer wants it to sound. And the way they do that is often with a comma. If you're playing a flute, for example, and you see a comma on the music, that's where you need to take a breath. Over the years, I've sung in a selection of choirs, and when you sing, the same applies. Singers are taught to breathe where there is punctuation in the words. So if there's a full stop, obviously you can take a breath. But also, if you're in need of taking a breath and there isn't a full stop anytime soon, you can take one where there is a comma. If you take a breath where there is no punctuation, it can make the words sound odd, it can make it sound wrong, and it can change the emphasis of the words and change the meaning. And we do this in speaking as well, not just in singing. We take all kinds of little pauses while we're speaking. We slow down and we speed up to add emphasis to what we're saying, to make it more understandable to the person we're speaking to. Obviously, in written language, we cannot speed up or slow down the writing, but what we can do is add punctuation and specifically commas to add little pauses, little bits of emphasis where we need them. The use of commas does vary slightly from one language to another. There are different conventions in different languages. I know, for example, in Russian that there are certain words that require a comma. But in English, there are 5 main reasons for using a comma. So let's take a look at those 5 reasons for using commas. First of all, a comma can be used to mark off a clause, to separate different clauses in a sentence. For example, to separate a relative clause from the main clause in the sentence. The relative clause gives additional information. The main clause gives the basic information of the sentence, but the relative clause adds a little bit of extra information, and we usually separate it off with commas at the beginning and end of that extra piece of information. So here's an example. The boy, whose mother works at the supermarket, plays in the school football team. So the main sentence here is, the boy plays in the school football team. That's the main clause of the sentence. But the writer of this sentence has also given us an extra piece of information. We're told that the boy's mother works at the supermarket. So that extra piece of information is known as the relative clause. So we separate that off with commas. We have a comma before and after that clause. And when you hear the sentence spoken, you can hear a slight pause at the beginning and end of that clause, separating it off in sound as well as in writing. The boy, whose mother works at the supermarket, plays in the school football team. The second use of commas is to separate items in a list. They can be individual words or phrases. And the words can be lists of nouns, adjectives, adverbs, or verbs. So let's take a look at a few examples. A typical example of a text I might be sent by my teenage son might say something like this. Can you work out how many items he's asking me to bring for him? Mum, can you bring football, boots, t-shirt and shorts? He could be asking me to bring 4 items, a football, boots, a t-shirt and a pair of shorts. Or he could be asking me to bring 3 items, football boots, t-shirt and shorts. And the way he tells me the difference between those is where he puts the commas. So that's a list of nouns, but we can also put adjectives in a list. For example, Jill was wearing a long blue floral cotton dress. There are 4 adjectives in this sentence, 4 adjectives describing Jill's dress. And as with a list of items, we separate those adjectives with a comma. We can do the same with adverbs and verbs. For example, the soloist played boldly, resolutely and majestically, and the adverbs are separated by commas. This doesn't just apply to single words though, we can do the same with phrases. If we have a list of different phrases, we separate those with commas too, to make it clearer what we're talking about. For example, before leaving the house, she packed her suitcase, turned off the gas and watered the plants. So she did 3 things before she left the house, each one described with a phrase and each phrase separated with a comma. However, the way commas are used in lists is often the subject of a very common debate. And this centres around something called the Oxford comma. What is the Oxford comma? Going back to my adverbs example, the soloist played boldly, resolutely and majestically. I haven't used a comma to separate the last 2 items on that list, because they're already separated by the word and. So the word and is already fulfilling the function that the comma would fulfill, and it's not really needed. But in my example of a list of phrases, I have used a comma for the last one. Before leaving the house, she packed her suitcase, comma, turned off the gas, comma, and watered the plants. So I have used a comma in there before the word and that is the Oxford comma. So should there be a comma as well as an and separating the last 2 items on the list? It is a matter of style, and the reason why this is called the Oxford comma is because it originated from the house style of Oxford University Press, where it was specified that that comma should be used. However, it is a matter of style. Personally, I prefer not to use that extra comma if the list is just made up of single words because the meaning is clear. But I do prefer to use it when my list is of phrases of more than one word for each item, because it just adds a little bit of extra clarity to the sentence. So however you decide to approach this issue is a matter of style, as long as the meaning of your writing is clear to the reader. The third use of commas in a sentence is where the clauses are inverted for emphasis. I've already talked a little bit about clauses. The main information in a sentence is called the main clause. We had a relative clause earlier where a little bit of extra information is inserted into the middle of the sentence. But there is also a subordinate clause which gives us secondary information, and usually the main clause comes first and the subordinate clause comes afterwards. However, sometimes we like to invert that and put the subordinate clause first for emphasis because we want to emphasize something in particular. For example, in the sentence, I decided to stay at home because I felt sick, we have the main clause at the beginning and the subordinate clause at the end. The main clause is I decided to stay at home. And the subordinate clause, the secondary information, is giving us the reason why you decided to do that. And there is no need to separate the two clauses in this version because they're following the conventional pattern. However, if we decide we want to put a bit more emphasis on the reason, we can turn the sentence around and put the subordinate clause at the beginning. So now it would look like this. Because I felt sick, I decided to stay at home. And this time we put a comma to separate the two clauses. So the first clause, which is the subordinate clause, because I felt sick, is followed by a comma. And you can also hear that when the person speaks, you can hear a slight pause and a slight emphasis on the subordinate clause. Because I felt sick, I decided to stay at home. The fourth reason for using a comma is when you are using direct speech in your writing. In English, direct speech is marked off with speech marks. Typically in the UK they would be single speech marks, whereas the convention in the US is very often to use double speech marks. However, we also need to separate the speech from the rest of the narrative with a comma. For example, Steve shouted, "Come and look at this." So the words that Steve actually shouts are included in quotation marks. But we also have a comma after shouted because the comma indicates this is the end of the narrative and you're about to hear some direct speech. We could also write that sentence the other way round. "Come and look at this," shouted Steve. Again, Steve's words are marked with quotation marks, but we also have a comma. And the comma, when we write it this way round, is inside the quotation marks. And the fifth reason for using a comma in writing is simply for clarity, anywhere where it would make the writing more understandable, which is also possibly where we might insert a short pause when we're speaking. For example, let's take a look at this sentence without a comma. Debbie arrived at the party with her friend and some food in a carrier bag. Without a comma, this sentence is ambiguous. We can guess from the context that the carrier bag only contains food, but that is not 100% clear from the way the sentence is written. The way the sentence is written, the carrier bag could also contain Debbie's friend. Debbie arrived at the party with her friend and some food in a carrier bag. So to be extra clear and to make sure the reader does not misunderstand what we're saying, we can add a comma. If we add a comma after friend, that inserts a slight pause and makes it clear to the reader that the friend is not in the carrier bag because it's separated off by a comma. So this time, if we put the comma in and insert a slight pause, it makes it clearer what the meaning really is. Debbie arrived at the party with her friend and some food in a carrier bag. Similarly, the sentence, Jim was walking the dog in Wellington boots. Logically, it would make sense that Jim was the one wearing Wellington boots, but the way the sentence is written does not specify that is the case. It could be the dog that's wearing the Wellington boots. So if we want to make that clear, we can insert a comma. And in speech, we would insert a slight pause. Jim was walking the dog in Wellington boots. As in the example that I quoted at the beginning, let's eat, children. We insert a comma when we're addressing someone, just to add that little bit of extra clarity. So here's another example. It was a pleasure to meet you, John. And when we're speaking, we change the tone of our voice. We can place a little bit of emphasis on John. We can add a little pause before John. But when we're writing, we use the comma to do that job. So those are the 5 main ways that commas are used in English. Let's take a look now at a couple of examples from literature. The book that I'm reading now is Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens is an expert in the use of language. Interestingly, as I've been reading Dickens' work, I have noticed that some of the rules of grammar and punctuation have changed a little over the last century and a half since Dickens was writing. But let's take a look now at a couple of sentences and how Dickens uses commas and why he has used his commas. The opening sentence of the book goes like this. In these times of ours, though concerning the exact year there is no need to be precise, a boat of dirty and disreputable appearance, with 2 figures in it, floated on the Thames between Southwark Bridge, which is of iron, and London Bridge, which is of stone, as an autumn evening was closing in. It is quite a long sentence, and so it does need some commas to break it up and to help it to breathe so that the reader isn't overwhelmed by information and trying to sort out which bit of information belongs with which. So let's take a look at the commas and why Dickens has used them. The first 2 commas are separating off a relative clause. In these times of ours, though concerning the exact year there is no need to be precise. So that little bit there is an aside from the author to the reader. It's just a little bit of extra information. It's a little extra comment. So he's separated it off with 2 commas, one at the beginning, one at the end. And then he does the same again. He carries on with his main clause, a boat of dirty and disreputable appearance, with 2 figures in it. So that's an extra piece of information, the 2 figures. So he separates that off with a comma at the beginning and the end again. Floated on the Thames, and then another clause, between Southwark Bridge, which is of iron, and London Bridge, which is of stone. And that is a list. Southwark Bridge is of iron, and London Bridge is of stone. So he's separating off 2 items in a list. And then he finishes off his sentence, as an autumn evening was closing in. So let's have a look at another sentence from further on in the book. And this sentence is direct speech, so it's one of the characters actually speaking. Pardon me, young woman, for speaking to you, but you are under some distress of mind. So one character is speaking to a young woman who is clearly troubled in some way about something. And because this person is addressing the young woman directly and calling her young woman, we need a comma to indicate that this is the person who is being spoken to. Pardon me, young woman, for speaking to you, and then we have another comma, because we're now getting a different clause with different information. And naturally, we might pause as we're saying it at that point. "Pardon me, young woman, for speaking to you, but you are under some distress of mind." Dickens does indeed use quite a lot of long sentences in his writing, so for Dickens especially, commas are particularly useful and particularly important. So now we've looked at the main rules for using commas and a couple of examples from Charles Dickens. Some of the rules are stricter than others, of course, and conventions vary depending on style, depending on the era in which the writer is writing. The rules for using commas with lists and direct speech are perhaps less open to negotiation, but some of the other rules can be. So when you're writing, try to listen to the flow of the writing. Read it aloud the way you would speak it. Listen to where you put the emphasis, where you slow down and speed up, and where you put in little tiny pauses. Then read it again like a robot, or like a child who's just learning to read and hasn't learnt how to put emphasis in their reading. Then you can hear how it sounds without those pauses or that speeding up or slowing down or that emphasis. And it might make it clearer to you where a comma might add some extra clarity to the writing. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. My next few videos are going to explore some more interesting aspects of language and literature, so I do hope you'll join me in those. And in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.